recording. And I would love to introduce our speaker for today, Rav from Shade of Miti. Rav is an urban farmer in Mississauga and in the region of Peel. And as a young BIPOC woman in agriculture, she started her organization to revolutionize the food and climate systems in Mississauga. Through her organization, she grows and sells organic produce, co-hosts the Lassie Revolution podcast, and envisions sustainable food systems in Mississauga that are rooted in sovereignty and justice and not threatened by climate change. So whenever you're ready to begin, you can go ahead.
Thanks. I never know where to look when people are introducing me because I feel like it's more awkward online, but thanks for that introduction. I wasn't sure if I could participate in the icebreaker, but before I begin, I'm going to show you a cool object that I have because I think that's a really cool icebreaker that you all did. So this is a pen with a little like fake diamond at the top. And I got this pen from my mentor a few weeks ago. And it's been really helping me do my business planning and farm planning and dreaming for next year. So I always have this at my desk now. Thanks for joining, everyone. I'm excited to be talking to you today, and I'm actually happy that it's a little bit of a smaller group. I'm used to talking to a lot of people online. So it's nice that it's a smaller group because I think it will help a lot with the discussions and whatnot. I'm going to share my screen. I have kind of like a PowerPoint that I wanted to go through. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat just so you don't forget during the presentation. And then I'll make sure that I get to them at the end. So like what you just heard, my name is Rav. I use she, her pronouns. And I run Shade of Miti, which is a food and climate justice organization in Peel. So we're just outside of Toronto, and Peel is made up of Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon, if you're not familiar with the area. And at Shade of Miti, we support sustainable food systems that are rooted in justice and sovereignty and not threatened by climate change. So there's kind of three areas that we focus on. We focus on growing, which I'll talk a lot about today. We also do a lot of education work. Most of this have been happening online, obviously, this year. So there's a lot of information and education resources on all my social media platforms that you can check out if you're interested. And then another education project that I wanted to let you all know about because it's fairly new and I think really cool is I'm working with another grassroots organization in Mississauga called Sustain Mississauga on creating a multi-language tree guide. So this tree guide will highlight 10 trees that people can find in and around Mississauga. And we have translated the tree guide, into 4 languages, English, Punjabi, Hindi, and then, there's 2 other languages that I think we're still trying to decide between. And the whole purpose of it is to encourage newcomers and racialized communities to explore our green spaces around the city. And then the third activity that we focus on is advocacy work. So one of the examples of our advocacy initiatives includes our podcast called The Lassie Revolution, which you can listen to anywhere podcasts are found, or if you're in Mississauga, the local radio station plays our podcast there also. So if anyone's interested, I'll share the links to all this information at the end. So the farm, because that's the exciting part that everyone always wants to know more about. I am in Mississauga, but my farm is in Caledon, so it's about 30 minutes north of the city. There's just a few pictures on the screen that show me at the farm and a few of the different vegetables that I grow. So I specialize in growing what would be labeled as cultural or world crops, and I put them in quotations because I don't necessarily like labeling my products like that, but they are cultural and world crops. So for example, I grow okra and bitter melon, which you can see on the bottom left of this screen. And I also grow hot peppers, eggplants, fenugreek, callaloo, Asian greens, and a bunch of other different things. And at the farm, it's really important for me that I use sustainable, organic, and climate-friendly growing practices wherever I can. So, for example, my irrigation system is powered by solar energy. All my food packaging is biodegradable and recyclable materials. I don't add any pesticides or fertilizers to my soil. So those are just some examples of how I bring in sustainable practices to the farm. I got into farming through environmental education. So after high school, I went to the University of Guelph, where I studied environmental science, and my goal was to become an environmental educator. And in my last year at university, I was looking for a summer job, and I saw an opportunity at a local farm. And it was really different than what anything I had done before, and I thought it sounded interesting. So I somehow got the job without having any farming experience. And I found out that I really, really loved it. So after I finished my undergrad, I was looking for jobs that were either farming or in environmental education, because those were the two things that I was now interested in. And I was really lucky because I found a job at a nonprofit in Mississauga that combined farming and environmental education. So I was working at a farm, and there were a lot of high school students and community members that would come every day to help me work at the farm, but also learn about how they can grow food at home. So that was really cool. And I worked there for about 4 or 5 years. And although the work was really, really fulfilling and satisfying, and I absolutely loved what I was doing, I just felt it was time for me to start my own farm and food and climate justice organization, because I was seeing a lot of inequities within our food and climate systems, especially for youth, newcomers, Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. So that's kind of how I got into farming. But today I wanted to talk about food justice, food sovereignty, and what those mean, because they are really big, complex topics that mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So before we go into what kind of these definitions of those things are, I wanted to talk about food and its intersections with different parts of our communities and societies, because if you take, even just like a minute to think about what food is, what it means to you, how you interact with it, you'll probably realize that food is usually more than just food. It's connected to a lot of different things within our communities. So just to get you or give you like an idea of all the different things that it can be connected to, I brainstormed some food intersectionality points on the screen. So there is politics. It can intersect with income and economics. It can intersect with community building, capitalism, colonialism, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, environment, and climate change, and housing. So I'm not going to talk too much more about the intersections of food. If you have specific questions on, maybe you don't really understand the connection between food and gender, for example, you can definitely put that in the chat, and I'll try to explain more in a bit. So I wanted to, like I mentioned, talk specifically more about food security, food justice, and food sovereignty. Before I am going to share, I guess, like a formal definition of each of these things, but I do want to acknowledge that there are a lot of different definitions for these three terms. Everyone kind of has their own definition of it, but there's definitely common themes that you'll see incorporated between all these definitions. So I'll share a definition, but I'll also talk about some of the more like common themes and what these concepts are focused on. Just so if you do see other definitions or whatever in the future, you can kind of understand at least like the foundation of these concepts. So food security, this definition is from the World Food Summit. And This definition says that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So with food security, the way that I like to think about it is kind of like a checklist. So there's different things on this checklist. There's economic access, access to sufficient food, access to safe food, access to nutritious food, food that meets dietary needs, et cetera, et cetera. It's a checklist. And if you or your community is able to check all the boxes on this criteria list, you can be, or you are, I guess, deemed to be food secure. If you're not able to check all the criteria that's included in this definition, then you're food insecure. So food security is kind of just describes the state of either your household or your community, whatever scale that you're looking at. It says you're either food secure or you're food insecure. It doesn't really tell us how we can get to food security if we're not already there. Or if we are experiencing food security, it doesn't tell us how we can, if circumstances changed, how we may lose food security. So a visualization that I like to use just to help me understand how food security interacts with food justice and food sovereignty is I think of food security as the goal. It's what we're aiming for. And there's so many different ways that we can try to get to food security, which is demonstrated by all these different arrows that are going towards the target. So for example, we can try to use industrial agriculture to achieve food security. We can try to use community food programs like food banks or mutual aid programs to get to food security. Or we can try to use food justice and food sovereignty as a way to get to food security. So food justice, one of the definitions that is used is that food justice seeks to ensure that the benefits and risks of where, what, and how food is grown, produced, transported, distributed, accessed, and eaten are shared fairly. Food justice represents a transformation of the current food system, including but not limited to eliminating disparities and inequities. So you can see from this definition compared to food security, it does indicate more of almost like an action-oriented definition. It tells us how we can achieve these things. So it says that we can try to eliminate disparities and inequities through food justice to get to food security, for example. Food sovereignty is honestly really similar to food justice. I think a lot of people sometimes use these terms interchangeably, although they are very distinct, and it is important to understand the differences, but there are definitely a lot of common points between them. So food sovereignty was a term that was coined by La Via Campesina. They're doing really, really amazing work in the food world. So I definitely encourage you to check them out if you're interested in peasant farmers and food sovereignty and just the food movement in general. So they define food sovereignty as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. So with sovereignty, you'll definitely, in any definition that you see of food sovereignty, you'll see that there's always this common theme of the right of people. So it's the right of yourself, the right of your community to really have a role in defining your food system how you want. So like I mentioned, between food justice and food sovereignty, there's a lot of common themes that run between them. So I just want to highlight 3 now, because like I said, you'll probably be, every time you look up food justice or food sovereignty or talk to someone about it, everyone's going to have slightly their own take on it. But these 3 things will show up in almost any justice and sovereignty discussion. So the first common point I wanted to highlight was planet and community first. So you may remember from both of the definitions that they both really center the planet and our communities. And they specifically highlight vulnerable human populations, such as Black, Indigenous, racialized, 2S LGBTQ+, disabled, low-income newcomers, etc. The second common point between these two concepts is there's always this idea of transformation. So they always talk about having to transform and change our systems to decrease inequities and disparities that exist within our current system. And then the third point is intersection. So it recognizes that food is very complex and that it intersects with all these different things in our community, some of which I highlighted at the very beginning. And it's really important to understand that and acknowledge that food intersects with, a lot of different things within our society, because it can help us understand food better. It can help us understand why there's certain issues within our food system. And most importantly, I think it can help us implement and suggest appropriate solutions that will lead to a more just, sustainable, and equitable food system. So the last thing that I wanted to share was just a few ideas of how we can practice allyship within farming, gardening, and eating. So even if you don't grow anything at home, we all eat, and there's really important actions that we can take as eaters and consumers to practice allyship to those working in our food systems. So some ideas that I had here, and if you do have any other ideas, please put them in the chat, because I'm sure we can all learn from each other. The first tip that I wanted to offer was to support BIPOC and 2S LGBTQ+ farmers and seed keepers. Especially in farming, there's a lot of work and attention being brought to farming organically, using permaculture, regenerative agriculture, things like that. And it's really important to recognize that all of these ways of farming have been championed by BIPOC communities, farmers and seed keepers for many, many decades and centuries. Another tip is to learn whose land you are eating and growing on. A third tip I have for you is to grow your own food and save and share your own seeds. I really believe that seed sovereignty is a really key aspect of food justice and food sovereignty, because everything in farming and everything in our food system starts with a seed. So whoever controls and owns our seeds, they definitely have a lot of input and influence within our food system. You can also connect with local people and organizations. And while you're connecting with these local communities and organizations, you can also support the global food movement and global food community. So if you're not really sure about how to go about that, some things that you can look into right now, which are really big movements happening in our global food community, is the farmer protests that are happening in India. You can look into Palestine and what's happening there and how it's impacting their food sovereignty. And you can also look into the United Nations Summit on Food, which is getting a lot of, criticism. And because of its downfalls, a lot of people got together and organized a counter summit called the Global People's Food Summit, which you can also look into and maybe you attend and learn from. So that was kind of all the information I wanted to share. I hope you kind of have a better idea of what food security, food justice, and food sovereignty mean, and how you can practice allyship within the food system. If you want to connect with me, all my information is up on the screen. I'll leave it up there for maybe another 30 seconds or so. But I'm happy to take any questions now or go back and clarify anything that maybe didn't make sense.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to stop the recording.